It was upon one of those drizzly March mornings, grey, oppressive, and thick with the scent of damp stone, that I was roused from a tepid slumber by the sudden rustle of Holmes's dressing gown. He had flung open the sitting-room window at Baker Street and stood, hawk-like, peering into the sullen fog as though it might part to reveal the answer to a question not yet asked. "You observe, Watson," he murmured, gesturing toward a thin, mud-spattered figure approaching in haste, the gait of a country rector who has not slept, the stoop of burden and the smudge on his sleeve. There is urgency, but not panic. A moral man pressed into a matter of violence. Indeed, moments later the bell rang sharply, and Mrs. Hudson, in her usual Scotch mutterings, ushered in the Reverend Augustus Wickham of St. Dunstan's parish in Harrow. He clutched his hat as if it might fly from his trembling hands. I do beg your pardon, Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson. I should not trouble you, but there has been a frightful occurrence, a thing most unnatural." Holmes inclined his head politely. "Please, Reverend, sit. Speak plainly." Wickham's voice cracked like a drying twig. "There is blood on the front steps of the vicarage. It appeared this morning, fresh, crimson, and nobody in sight. And that is not all. There are drag marks down the stone path, toward the old lich gate." He paused, breath hitching. "I fear something terrible has happened, but there is no sign of a soul. No scream in the night, no witnesses, only that stain." Holmes steepled his fingers. "No sign of forced entry?" "None. The vicarage was locked tight. My curate swears he heard nothing. And yet—" Watson took up his notebook, noting the details. Holmes rose. "I will require a hansom and your return company, Reverend. I presume you have not yet informed the local constable?" "No," said the clergyman. I thought this beyond their ken." "A reasonable assumption," Holmes replied. "We leave at once." The vicarage at Harrow sat at the end of a lonesome lane, framed by yew trees and a pair of ancient gargoyles that appeared more mournful than menacing. The air was thick with mist, and the sound of church bells from the distant town did little to dispel the eerie calm. Watson crouched over the steps, examining the thick smear of drying blood that trailed from the threshold to the path. "It's not animal," he said grimly. "Too much volume. And the pattern, see here, it pools, then narrows." Holmes was already pacing, tapping the tip of his cane on the flagstones, eyes alight with calculations. "No footprints," he muttered, "despite the rain last night. Which means this was done this morning, or—" He paused beside a low bush and knelt. "Here, fibres, torn cloth, a thread of wool and, perhaps tweed." He turned back toward the steps, and yet no struggle, no signs of entry, just the drag marks ending beneath the gate's shadow. Watson peered into the overgrown graveyard beyond the gate, its stones leaning like dozing sentinels. And no body. "No," said Holmes, "but a message nonetheless." This was deliberate. They moved inside the vicarage where Wickham's study lay untouched, except for one peculiar detail. A framed portrait of his predecessor, the late Canon Morley, had been tilted askew on the wall. Watson stepped closer. "Curious," he said. "Nothing else is disturbed, but the angle, it's precise, almost purposeful." Holmes smiled thinly. "Just so, and now, Reverend, may I see your guest registry?" "Guest registry?" The man blinked. "Yes, for the past 3 weeks, if you please. And also I must ask, has anyone recently expressed a sudden interest in the church grounds? The crypts, perhaps?" The vicar hesitated, then nodded. "Yes. A Mr. Allerton, a visiting scholar, said he was researching ecclesiastical architecture. He was quite insistent on being left alone." "Was he now?" Holmes asked, his voice tightening. Outside, the bells tolled 11, and somewhere beneath the sodden yews, the lich gate creaked As they prepared to explore the crypt that afternoon, Holmes leaned toward Watson. "Mark my words, my dear fellow, this morning's blood was not meant to hide a crime. It was meant to declare one." Watson blinked. "You believe the victim still lives?" "I believe," said Holmes grimly, "that whoever vanished beneath those steps is playing a game, one with a dreadful history and a very modern motive, and the first move has only just been made. The crypts of St. Dunstan's were older than the church itself. Hewn from limestone and slate, their narrow chambers stretched beneath the nave like the roots of a long dead tree, twisting, shadowed, and too still for comfort. As Holmes and I followed Reverend Wickham through the iron gate and down the steps into the earth, the air shifted from damp to cold, tinged with the iron tang of mildew and forgotten bones. A lantern swung in the vicar's unsteady hand, casting flickering shadows on the curved ceiling. Holmes walked ahead, his cane tapping with measured purpose. Every few steps he paused, observing scratch marks on stone, water stains, even spiderwebs that had recently been broken. "It's been disturbed," he murmured. "This corridor is usually sealed?" "Yes," replied Wickham, "except when Mr. Allerton insisted upon access. He said he had written approval from the diocesan archivist." "And did he?" The vicar hesitated. "He produced a letter. I did not examine it closely. It bore a seal." Holmes said nothing, but I saw the familiar narrowing of his eyes. The subtle tightening of his jaw that meant suspicion had crystallized into belief. We reached a small chamber at the end of the corridor. A crumbling altar, draped in decaying velvet, stood at the center. To the left, a slab had been shifted askew, heavy, cracked, and bearing the Latin inscription, "Sanguis Testis." "The blood of the witness," Holmes translated. He knelt and ran his fingers along the edge where dust had been displaced. "Recently moved," he said, "but not fully opened. Whoever did this either lacked the strength or feared what lay beneath." He straightened and turned to Wickham. "This Mr. Allerton, what do you know of him?" "Only that he arrived last Thursday and took rooms at the inn near the Green. A solitary man. Tall, thin, grey about the temples. He spoke with a slight Oxford accent and often carried a notebook. Seemed intense." "A man fond of shadows," Holmes muttered. "Did he say what exactly he was searching for in the crypt?" "Merely that he was tracing the architectural features of the Saxon foundations," Wickham replied. "He showed particular interest in the eastern wing, though nothing remains there now but rubble." Holmes turned back to the disturbed slab. "And yet he returned here often." He gestured for us to leave. "Come, the inn is our next stop." The Harrow. Green Inn was a modest affair, a gabled structure with smoky windows and a cheerful hearth in the public room. The innkeeper, a stout woman named Mrs. Daltrey, met us with flushed cheeks and wary eyes. "Yes, Mr. Allerton stayed here," she said. "He came down for supper most evenings, but kept to himself. Always writing in his little book, he was. Pale sort of man with a cough. Didn't speak much." "When did you last see him?" asked Holmes. 2 nights ago. He left after supper, said he was going to the churchyard to sketch by moonlight. I told him it wasn't wise, what with the paths being slick and the ground so old. But he waved me off. That was the last of him." "And he hasn't returned?" "No. I checked his room this morning after the vicar stopped by. His coat's still on the peg. The bed hasn't been slept in." Holmes requested to see the room. We followed Mrs. Daltrey up a narrow stair to a plainly furnished chamber. The air was stale and the curtains had been drawn shut. Holmes moved swiftly, opening drawers, tapping along the wainscot, and examining the wastepaper basket. "There's no sign of struggle," I noted. "No," Holmes agreed, "but also no sign of luggage. He arrived with a satchel, did he not?" "He did." said the innkeeper. "Brown leather, old and cracked. I haven't seen it since he left that night." Holmes opened the wardrobe. A single coat hung from the hook. He reached into the pocket and withdrew a small key, iron, ornate, and engraved with a faint symbol that looked like a cross within a circle. He examined it, then slipped it into his pocket. "We may need this later." On the desk sat a thin volume, a copy of Thomas à Kempis' The Imitation of Christ, its edges worn. Holmes opened the cover, revealing a pasted bookplate, Allerton's name, written in a tight, elegant script. "His real name," Holmes murmured, "may not be Allerton." He turned to Mrs. Daltrey. "Do you recall if he received any visitors or letters?" "Just one," she said. "A boy delivered it on Sunday afternoon. Mr. Allerton didn't open it in front of me, took it straight upstairs." "Was it left behind?" "I didn't see one." Holmes knelt and examined the underside of the writing desk. "Ah." With a deft motion, he retrieved a single envelope affixed with sealing wax, tucked behind the drawer lining. It bore no address, only a crimson smudge where the seal had been broken. He opened it and scanned the contents quickly. "Well?" I asked. He handed it to me. The letter inside was short and cryptic. "The sins of the fathers lie beneath the stone. Midnight will reveal what the church would bury." There was no signature. Holmes stood abruptly. "Watson, I must speak with the diocesan archivist, and Reverend Wickham must confirm whether any Morley family descendants remain in the area." "Do you believe Mr. Allerton is one of them?" I asked. "I believe," Holmes said slowly, "that we are dealing with a man obsessed with an inheritance of secrets, and I do not speak of money." By dusk we had returned to the vicarage. Holmes stood once more at the top of the stone steps where the morning's bloodstain had first been found. It had darkened, hardened, its mystery no less vivid. "Watson," he said quietly, "there is a second footprint beneath the trail, smaller, a woman's." I squinted. "You're sure?" "Quite. And if I'm not mistaken, she arrived after the blood was spilled." "Not before." "Then the vicarage had another visitor?" Holmes nodded, his voice low. "Someone who knows what was meant to be found and what was meant to be hidden." The following morning found Holmes and me seated once more in the Reverend's study. Rain had returned, drumming gently on the leaded glass, its rhythm broken only by the distant creak of the old lich gate. Wickham, weary and pale, poured tea with trembling fingers. "I have sent word to the diocesan archivist," he said, setting down the pot with a rattle. "But I must confess, Mr. Holmes, I am ill at ease. The events of the past 2 days feel more like some morbid tale from the pulpit than reality." Holmes gave a brief nod. "It is precisely such tales, Reverend, that often draw the guilty into motion. The theatre of fear has always been fertile ground for secrets." He turned to me. "Watson, have you the envelope from Allerton's room?" I retrieved it from my satchel. Holmes held it beneath the lamplight, then drew a magnifying lens from his pocket and studied the crimson wax. "Observe," he murmured. "This seal, though smeared, bears a faint impression, a ring, likely, 2 overlapping letters, M and R." "Morley?" I ventured. "Possibly," Holmes replied, "or someone wishing us to think so." At that moment Mrs. Hudson announced a visitor, a Miss Cora Danvers. Holmes's brow lifted. "Show her in." A moment later, a tall woman in her late 30s entered, cloaked in navy wool and gloved despite the warmth of the fire. A veil of fine black lace obscured her features, but her bearing was unmistakably aristocratic. Rigid spine, measured breath, and the calm of one well practiced in concealment. "Miss Danvers," Holmes greeted her. "Or should I say, Miss Morley?" She froze only for a second before removing her gloves with deliberate grace. "I expected you might deduce that," she said, voice low and composed. "You are as perceptive as they say, Mr. Holmes." "Not always," he said, motioning for her to sit. "But I do know when a woman treads steps she is forbidden to enter." "It was your footprint, wasn't it, Miss Morley?" "Yes," she replied. "I came early yesterday. Before the vicar awoke, I had no key. I did not enter the house." "And the blood?" I asked. She shook her head. I was as shocked as anyone. I left at once and said nothing. I feared it was a warning meant for me. Holmes studied her carefully. "A warning from whom?" "I don't know, but I believe it has to do with the man calling himself Mr. Allerton." "Go on," Holmes said quietly. She glanced toward the window as though to gauge how far her words might carry. "My name is Cora Danvers by marriage, but I was born Cora Morley, niece of Canon Ephraim Morley, the man who served St. Dunstan's before Reverend Wickham. My uncle passed away some 20 years ago, but he was not a kindly man, stern, controlling, and during his tenure here, something happened, something buried." "Buried," Holmes repeated, "literally and figuratively. My cousin Henry, his only child, disappeared in 1879. Now, the official account claimed he fell into the river near Marley Bridge and drowned, but no body was ever recovered. I was 13. I remember the whispers that he'd run away, that he'd been sent to a sanatorium, that he'd uncovered something in the crypt and vanished." Her voice trembled now. "My uncle forbade all mention of Henry after that. He had the boy's room sealed. My aunt never recovered. And then nothing. Silence for 2 decades. And the connection to Allerton? 3 weeks ago, I received a letter. It was unsigned, but it said that the truth about Henry lay beneath the vicarage, that the church had hidden a crime, and that someone was finally ready to unearth it. I came to Harrow, hoping to uncover more." Holmes leaned forward, fingers steepled. "Tell me, Miss Morley, have you ever seen the man calling himself Allerton?" She hesitated. "Once, from a distance. 2 nights ago, I watched from the hedge as he emerged from the crypts. He walked like an old man, limping slightly, but he carried something beneath his coat, a parcel, square, wrapped in linen." Holmes's eyes flashed. "You're certain?" She nodded. "And you haven't seen him since?" "No, that's when I left. I returned early the next morning to speak with the vicar. That was when I saw the blood." A silence settled over the room, broken only by the ticking of the long case clock. Holmes stood. "Miss Morley, I believe your visit may prove invaluable, but for your safety, I must ask you to remain close to the village for the next day or 2. I will send word if I require further details." She rose, lifting her veil once more. "I hope you find the truth, Mr. Holmes, but tread carefully. My uncle had powerful friends in the church, men who would rather burn old records than see them read." When she had gone, Holmes turned to the vicar. "Reverend, I will need access to Canon Morley's sealed records, the vestry ledgers, parish correspondences, and particularly any documents from 1878 to 1880. I assume they're kept in the vestry archive." Wickham shifted uncomfortably. "Yes, though they haven't been touched in years. The bishop ordered some files destroyed long ago. I cannot guarantee their completeness. Then we must hope something slipped through the fire." Later that afternoon, Holmes and I ventured into the vestry. Dust clung to the shelves like a second skin, and the scent of parchment and mildew mingled with the cold. Holmes pulled on a pair of gloves and began combing through the ledgers. "Here," he said suddenly, producing a thin file. Ephraim Morley, burials 1879. He opened it. There were entries for paupers, infants, and townsfolk, until one final strange note. March 12th. Private interment, no ceremony, no headstone. Notes withheld at request of family. Initials only, H.M. H.M., Holmes repeated softly. Henry Morley. But no official death record, I asked. Holmes shook his head. None. He closed the file and turned to me. Watson, someone buried a boy without a grave, and now, after 20 years, someone else has come to dig him up. The graveyard of St. Dunstan's had taken on a different character by twilight. The mist clung low among the tombstones like a shroud, blurring the dates and names carved into old, lichen-slick stone. Holmes moved silently through the rows, the collar of his coat turned up against the chill, his steps purposeful but unhurried. Somewhere near here, he said, there lies a grave marked only by initials, or perhaps not marked at all. We stopped beneath a gnarled yew tree whose roots gripped the soil like skeletal hands. The ground beneath was uneven and slightly sunken, hardly noticeable to a casual passer-by, but clear enough to Holmes's practiced eye. Look closely, Watson, he said, pointing with his cane. The grass is of a slightly different shade, re-sodded, I believe, years ago, but the outline still lingers. I squatted beside the patch and pressed my hand to the earth. It was firm, undisturbed, but unnaturally flat in contrast to the others. No headstone, I said. No, Holmes replied, but this could be the resting place noted in the vestry record. March 12th, 1879, initials only, buried at the family's request without public notice. If the boy died naturally or even tragically but honourably, why such secrecy? I glanced around. Do you suppose something was buried with him? Something Allerton hoped to recover? Holmes didn't answer immediately. He crouched and began inspecting the surrounding stones. After a moment, he tapped one with his gloved finger. This one here, Eleanor Thistlewood, died 1878, but the stone appears newer than the date would suggest. He brushed away a film of dirt and lichen, revealing a barely visible engraving beneath the primary inscription. A second name had been carved and then scratched out, as though someone had attempted to reuse the marker and then conceal the alteration. H.M., I read aloud, squinting. Holmes stood, brushing off his knees. Grave tampering, likely an attempt to disguise or reassign the plot. Someone wanted to hide Henry Morley not only in death, but from history. A low cough interrupted our thoughts. We turned to see a figure watching from the gate, an older man, lean, with silver hair and a stiff gait. He wore a wool scarf tucked into a brown coat and held a walking stick. I recognized him vaguely from town. "Begging your pardon, gentlemen," he said. "Didn't mean to eavesdrop, only I couldn't help overhearing the name Morley." Holmes inclined his head. "You know something of the family?" The man stepped forward. "I was the groundskeeper's apprentice in '79, just a boy then. Name's Aldous Finch. I recall that burial." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "You do?" Finch nodded. "My master was called to dig a grave at short notice. No ceremony, no parish announcement. I remember because it was freezing that day. We weren't given a name, only told to prepare a private plot behind the yew. Said it was a matter of church discretion." "Was Canon Morley present?" I asked. "Aye, he stood watch the whole time. Wouldn't let us linger. I never saw a coffin come in, just a long bundle, wrapped tight. We thought it odd, but who were we to question a man of the cloth?" "Did you ever hear mention of Henry Morley afterward?" Holmes asked. Finch hesitated. Not aloud, but there were rumours. That he'd uncovered something he shouldn't have, old family sins, money owed, or worse. He paused, glancing at the disturbed earth. "When I saw the blood on the steps this week," he said, "I feared it had all come back." Holmes thanked him and turned toward the vicarage. "Watson," he said as we walked, "if someone did return to that grave, they may not have been searching for a body. They may have been retrieving something buried with it." "A document?" I ventured. "Possibly. A diary, a confession, something Henry possessed, something worth silencing him for." Back at the vicarage, we found Reverend Wickham awaiting us in the study, nervously twisting his spectacles. "I have news," he said. "The diocesan archivist replied by telegraph. He confirms that the signature on Allerton's letter of access is a forgery. No permission was granted to explore the crypts. Furthermore, no one of that name appears in the university's records for the past 2 decades. Holmes showed no surprise. "I suspected as much," he said. "The man used an assumed name, an assumed purpose, and forged his way beneath this church." Wickham hesitated. "There's more. He mentioned in passing that Canon Morley had a strained relationship with the bishopric. There were complaints filed, vague, unsubstantiated, something about lost funds. And this is odd. One of the complaints was signed anonymously with the initials H.M. Holmes's smile was brief and humourless. "So Henry wasn't merely a troubled youth, he was a whistleblower." I leaned forward. Which means, Holmes said, his disappearance was not merely a family tragedy. It was a silencing. As night fell, Holmes requested a final search of Allerton's room. With Mrs. Daltrey's permission, we re-entered the small chamber. Holmes made for the fireplace and examined the ashes. "Recently burned," he murmured, "but not entirely. Ah, so what's this?" He used tongs to lift a curled scrap of paper from the grate, blackened along the edges but legible in parts. A date was visible, March 11th, 1879, and a partial sentence. "Cannot let the bishop know. Henry has written it all down." Holmes pressed the paper flat. "Watson," he said, "we're no longer dealing with conjecture. There was a record, a written account of something Canon Morley wished to keep hidden. And Mr. Allerton, whatever his true identity, was close to recovering it." "But where is he now?" I asked. "And what of the blood?" Holmes moved to the window and peered into the night. "That," he said, "is what we must discover before morning, for I fear the next grave to be dug may not wait another 20 years. The fog returned by midnight, heavier than before, descending on Harrow like a gauze drawn over a corpse. Street lamps glowed dimly behind veils of mist, and the cobbled lanes gleamed slick with dew. Holmes strode ahead of me along the road toward the green, his coat flaring behind him, the silhouette of purpose etched into every step. I followed in silence, my thoughts circling back to the blood on the vicar's steps, the vanished scholar, and the unmarked grave we had found beneath the yew. We arrived once more at the Harrow Green Inn. The sign above the lintel creaked faintly in the breeze, and a single candle still glowed in a front window. Mrs. Daltrey opened the door in her dressing gown, her expression tight with worry. "Back again, Mr. Holmes?" she whispered. "Is something the matter?" "I believe so," Holmes said. "Do any of your rooms face the rear alley?" "Aye, number 9 does." "And was that the room Mr. Allerton originally requested?" She blinked. "Yes, come to think of it. Though I gave him number 6 instead, 9's fireplace hadn't been cleaned." Holmes exchanged a glance with me, then turned back to her. "Might we see number 9 now?" Without a word, she fetched the key from behind the counter and led us up the back stairs. The hallway was narrow and dark, the only light coming from a small window at the far end. Room 9 stood at the corner of the building, its door long and slightly warped. Mrs. Daltrey unlocked it and stepped aside. The room was cold, unoccupied, and reeked faintly of soot and dust. Holmes entered at once, his eyes scanning the walls, the hearth, the windowsill. "This," he said, "is where he meant to stay, not number 6. He went straight to the fireplace and knelt beside it, brushing away a layer of cold ash. His fingers stopped on something embedded in the soot. He produced a folded piece of linen, partially charred and smudged with dark streaks. He unfolded it carefully. "Blood," I said at once, "still damp in places." Holmes nodded. "And not from 3 days ago. This was soaked within the last 36 hours. Mrs. Daltrey gasped softly. "You think someone bled here?" "I think someone was here," Holmes said, "and possibly wounded, but not mortally." He turned his attention to the floorboards beside the hearth. Several were discoloured, faint scuffs in the wood, as if from boots being dragged. He followed the marks toward the rear wall. "Watson, do you see?" I crouched. Yes, a smear, mud or perhaps blood, trailing toward the wardrobe. Holmes flung open the wardrobe. Empty. But then, crouching again, he tapped gently on the rear panel. It gave way with a faint creak, revealing a small cavity behind the woodwork. Nestled within was a crumpled envelope, water-damaged and sealed with a black wax emblem. Holmes extracted it without a word and opened the flap. Inside was a letter, scrawled hastily, the ink blotched in places. He read aloud, "To whoever finds this. I was wrong to come. The vicarage hides more than I imagined. I fear I am being followed. I do not know whom I can trust. If I do not return, the key is hidden behind the crest above the chancel. The truth lies with the bell ringer's log, March 11th. They will try to erase everything." I stared at Holmes. "The bell ringer's log, that's not a parish record." "No," Holmes said, standing. "It's a personal notebook, likely kept by a church servant, overlooked in official archives, and the mention of a crest above the chancel. Curious. Could the key be literal? Very likely, and if so, it may open something the canon meant to keep forever sealed." We left the inn just before 1 o'clock. Outside, the village lay still, the air thick with damp and silence. As we approached the church, the bell tower loomed overhead like a silent sentinel, its iron cross barely visible in the mist. Holmes motioned for me to remain near the gate while he circled around the rear of the church. He returned shortly after, carrying a long-handled thatching pole he had borrowed from the groundskeeper's shed. Inside, the nave was dark and cold, lit only by our lanterns. The stained glass windows glared like ghostly eyes, and our footsteps echoed softly along the flagstone aisle. Holmes approached the altar and peered upward toward the ornate wooden chancel screen. At the top, a carved crest, weathered but still faintly gilded, was fixed into the arch. A Latin motto encircled the emblem, Veritas sine timore, truth without fear. Holmes raised the pole and gently prodded the underside of the crest. The wood gave a faint click, and a small brass object tumbled free, landing with a muffled clink on the carpeted altar steps. A key. Old, blackened with age, but unmistakably forged for a specific lock. Holmes held it up to the lantern light. "The second key in this case," he murmured. "And the first was in Allerton's coat," I said. "Then this is no ordinary parish crime." "No," Holmes replied, slipping the key into his pocket. "This is a vault mystery, a sealed chamber, possibly hidden by Canon Morley himself, a place no one has entered since Henry disappeared." We returned to the vestry where Reverend Wickham had remained by the fire, dozing in an armchair with a sermon draft in his lap. He startled awake at our arrival. Holmes wasted no time. "Reverend, was there ever a bell ringer during Canon Morley's tenure by the name of Griggs?" Wickham blinked. "Yes. Arthur Griggs. He served until 1881, I believe. Retired after a fall from the tower steps. Died shortly after. Why? Did he keep any form of personal record?" Wickham frowned. Now that you mention it, there was a small notebook we found when cleaning out the tower. It was mostly filled with toll times and idle notes. I think it's in the lower drawer of the vestry cabinet. He led us to the filing cabinet and opened the drawer. After several minutes of searching, he produced a thin, leather-bound volume, the cover bearing only the word "Tolls" in fading ink. Holmes opened it and flipped to March of 1879. Midway down the page, he stopped. His finger traced a line. March 11th, toll at 9 p.m. Called by C. Morley. No funeral scheduled, no mourners. 4 men carried. A bundle. Canon dismissed me early. He turned the page. March 12th, no toll. But soil disturbed by chancel steps. Blood on cuff. Dog barked all night. Canon said nothing. Holmes snapped the book shut. "Watson," he said quietly, "we were wrong. Henry Morley did not simply die." He looked toward the altar, his voice low. He was silenced, and something else, something they buried with him, was worth enough to try again 20 years later. Morning broke reluctantly over Harrow, its light wan and filtered through a persistent veil of fog. The village awoke with its usual quiet rustle. Milk carts clattered over cobblestones, chimney smoke curled skyward, and in the distance the bells of St. Dunstan's rang out a cautious quarter-hour past 8. But within the ancient stone walls of the church all was still. Holmes stood beneath the organ loft, eyes lifted to a panel behind the towering pipes, barely visible unless one knew where to look. I had grown familiar with the church's architecture over the past days, yet I had never noticed the square of discoloured stone tucked beneath the instrument's base. It was unmarked, unadorned, and curiously offset from the symmetry that otherwise governed the chancel's design. "An irregularity," Holmes murmured, "always invites curiosity." He knelt and ran his hand along the stone's edge. A shallow groove ran beneath his fingertips, then stopped, cut cleanly on one side. "See here, Watson," he said, beckoning me. A concealed hinge, rusted from disuse. "This is no ordinary panel." I crouched beside him. "A hatch of some kind?" "Precisely. And I believe this is what Canon Morley never intended to be reopened." He reached into his coat and withdrew the second key, the one retrieved from above the chancel crest. The lock was not immediately apparent, but with a gentle nudge of his cane, Holmes located a small indentation near the base of the stone. He inserted the key. It resisted for a moment, then turned with a click that echoed faintly through the empty nave. Slowly, Holmes lifted the hatch. Beneath it, stone steps descended into a narrow shaft, steep, dry, and cloaked in a cold, unmoving air. Dust floated in thin shafts of light from the organ pipes above, catching in our throats. "I shall go first," Holmes said, lighting the lantern he had brought from the vestry. "I'm coming with you," I replied, somewhat more firmly than I expected. He gave me a rare half-smile. "Naturally." We descended carefully, the stone slick with time and the occasional drop of moisture. The air grew colder with each step, until we emerged into a low, barrel-vaulted chamber. The walls were rough-hewn, lined with ancient brickwork, some of it crumbling, some still remarkably sound. At the far end stood an iron gate, ornate, locked, and sealed, with wax so old it had turned brittle. Upon the seal was a faint impression. A bishop's ring. Holmes examined it closely. "An ecclesiastical seal," he said, "used when a chamber is closed under clerical authority. Whatever lies beyond this gate was not merely hidden, it was sanctioned to remain so." He turned to me. "Watson, break the seal." I hesitated only a moment before drawing my pocket-knife and scraping the brittle wax away. The gate swung open with a groan, revealing a narrow vestibule lined with dust-laden crates and a small wooden lectern at the centre. Holmes moved immediately to the crates. The first he opened contained water-damaged hymnals and discarded altar linens. The second, however, held something stranger. "Look," he said. Inside lay stacks of parchment-bound documents tied with black ribbon. One bore the words, Testimonium Privatum, 1878, to be held in confidence of the Church until judgment be required. Holmes opened the document gently. His eyes moved quickly across the page, then stopped. He held it up for me to see. Concerning the confession of Canon Ephraim Morley, I, Bishop Andrew of the Southern Diocese, acknowledge receipt of charges that a member of the clergy has made illicit use of church funds to secure property in his own name, and has coerced silence from a familial witness. The said witness, H.M., is alleged to have documented these actions in a personal diary, now believed missing. It is the recommendation of this office that the matter be sealed until further determination, and the vault beneath St. Dunstan's be closed to all but the bishopric until the truth can be safely ascertained. I looked at Holmes in disbelief. "They knew," he nodded grimly, "and chose silence over justice." Behind the lectern lay a chest, small, brass-bound, and padlocked. Holmes inserted the first key, the one found in Allerton's coat, and turned it. The lock opened. Inside was a bundle wrapped in oilcloth. He laid it gently upon the lectern and unwrapped the bundle. A leather-bound book emerged, its cover cracked, but its pages preserved. Holmes read the first line aloud. "If this should be found, let it be known I, Henry Morley, did not take my life nor vanish by choice." He closed the book. "We've found it, Watson." Back in the vestry, Holmes laid the diary on the vicar's desk while I poured tea with a trembling hand. Miss Cora Morley arrived soon after, having been summoned by Holmes's brief note. She entered quietly, her gloves still damp from the morning fog. "You found something?" she said, glancing at the diary. Holmes nodded. "We have." She took a hesitant step closer. "Did he? Was my cousin still alive when—" "We believe Henry Morley was murdered," Holmes said softly. "His body hidden, his death attributed to disappearance. This diary contains a detailed account of the events leading up to that day, his discovery of his father's corruption, his attempt to reveal it, and the threats he received from members of the clergy." Cora sank into a chair. He was only 17. Holmes rested the book beside her, and he was silenced to protect reputations that have long since turned to dust. Wickham, who had remained respectfully silent until now, stepped forward. "What are your intentions, Mr. Holmes?" "To ensure this is no longer hidden," Holmes replied, "and to discover who else has recently learned the truth." I looked up. "You mean whoever posed as Allerton?" Holmes nodded. "Allerton may have come seeking justice, or retribution. But I fear he is not the only one." He turned toward the diary. "There are still pages missing, torn out, likely taken by whoever left the blood on the vicar's steps." "And you think they plan to return?" I asked. Holmes's voice was low. "I think they never left." It was shortly after midday when the second shadow fell across the case. We had returned from St. Dunstan's vault to the vicarage with the recovered diary safely in Holmes's possession, tucked inside his inner coat pocket as though it were a crown jewel. Miss Cora Morley remained behind to compose herself, seated by the fire with a distant look in her eyes, her gloves still clutched tightly in her lap. Reverend Wickham offered a weak cup of tea, but her mind was clearly elsewhere, her past perhaps, unravelling into something crueler than memory had allowed. Holmes stood at the front window, peering across the village green. His eyes, sharp beneath the brim of his hat, did not waver. "Watson," he said quietly, "what do you make of a man who vanishes a second time?" I blinked. "You mean Allerton?" "No," Holmes replied, turning toward me with a grim expression. "I mean Aldous Finch." The old groundskeeper's apprentice, now caretaker of the churchyard, had not been seen since the previous evening. Mrs. Daltrey, we later learned, had sent a boy round with a parcel of meat and cheese, only to find Finch's small cottage at the edge of the graveyard locked from within, the fire cold, and no answer at the door. His coat still hung by the hearth, his boots beneath the stool. "What concerns me," Holmes said, pacing slowly, "is not that Finch is missing, it's that someone had reason to silence him now." "Because he remembered the burial?" I asked. Holmes nodded. "Or because he said too much? Someone knew he spoke to us." A knock came at the door. Wickham opened it to reveal Constable Merrick, the local officer, a broad-shouldered man with muddy boots and a notebook perpetually tucked under his arm. He removed his helmet as he entered, nodding curtly to all. "Mr. Holmes, I've just come from the churchyard." Holmes gestured for him to continue. "It's Finch," Merrick said. "He's not at the cottage, but we found something strange in the stone tool shed by the eastern wall. The padlock was snapped, and inside we found blood. Not a lot, just a smear on the edge of the workbench and a torn scrap of cloth." He held out the cloth, stained a dull brown. Holmes took it, examining the weave with quick fingers. "Tweed, from Finch's coat." Merrick nodded. "But there's no sign of struggle outside, no drag marks, no prints, even in the soft earth." Holmes looked sharply at him. "So it was deliberate, clean." "Could be," the constable said. "But there's more. We found a set of footprints in the old vestry garden, smaller than Finch's, narrow-heeled like a woman's. They led in, but not out." Holmes turned toward the fire where Miss Morley still sat. "Miss Morley," he said gently, "did you return to the church last night?" She looked up, startled. "No, I was at the inn. I didn't sleep well, but I didn't leave my room." Holmes studied her for a long moment, then turned back to Merrick. "You say the footprints ended inside the garden?" Merrick nodded. "Correct. We checked the hedgerow, nothing's broken. Whoever it was didn't climb back out." Holmes turned to me. "Watson, we must go to the shed." The churchyard lay under a grey sky, windless and oppressively still. The old shed stood at the far end, tucked between two half-collapsed tombs and the rear wall. Its door now hung open on broken hinges. Inside, the air was close and metallic with the scent of rust and old wood. Holmes knelt near the workbench. The smear of blood, though darkened, was clear against the grain. On the ground beside it, he found scuffed marks like the toes of boots that had dug into the dirt while resisting. "He struggled," Holmes murmured. "Not for long, but enough to leave this." He held up a thin splinter, broken cleanly and curved slightly. "This is from a violin string." I blinked. "A violin string?" Holmes nodded. "Strung tightly between two ends, possibly used as a garrote. Quiet, efficient, not improvised." He rose, brushing his knees. "Whoever did this knew Finch's habits. They waited here, knew he'd come to fetch tools as he did most mornings." "But why take him?" I asked. "Why not simply kill him and leave the body?" Holmes's eyes narrowed. "Because they wanted information, or silence. If Finch is alive, he's being held. If he's dead, the body is hidden where none of us have thought to look." By early evening, we had returned once more to the inn. Holmes had grown quiet, dangerously so. It was a mood I had come to recognize over years of cases. When his thoughts began to outpace his speech, and he retreated behind those grey eyes. Conclusions were forming, but not yet settled. As we sat in the corner of the inn's public room, he motioned for a glass of hot water with lemon, then turned to me. "Watson," he said, "do you remember the parish registry?" "Of course." There was a burial logged for March 12th, 1879, marked with initials only HM, but do you recall the entry just above it? I thought back. An infant, unnamed, died at birth. Holmes nodded. Yes. But what if that entry was false? What if it was a decoy meant to misdirect anyone reviewing the records? What if more than one burial occurred that week? You mean there may be a second unmarked grave? Holmes's expression hardened. Yes, and if Finch knew where it was, then he may be the only person alive with that knowledge. Just then, a quiet knock came at the inn's side door. Mrs. Daltrey stepped in, looking flustered. "Mr. Holmes, a letter arrived for you. No postmark, left on the doorstep." Holmes took the envelope, opened it carefully, and read the single sentence aloud. "Go no further. The sins of the father do not belong to the living." There was no signature, only a small mark, 2 interlocking rings in wax. He folded the letter and stood. "We're being warned, Watson." I looked at him. "Will we heed it?" Holmes's smile returned, cold and resolute. "No, we'll do precisely the opposite." That same night, as darkness once more swallowed the village, Holmes and I returned to the grounds of St. Dunstan's, not by the vicarage path or the chapel doors, but by the overgrown perimeter wall, where ivy clung like old gilt, and the stones shifted underfoot. Holmes had wrapped the anonymous letter in oilskin and tucked it into his breast pocket, saying little during the walk, except to mutter, 2 rings. Curious. Ecclesiastical? Heraldic? Or perhaps ceremonial? He paused at the eastern edge of the graveyard, just where the land began to slope downward toward the stream. The wind had picked up, pulling mist in long, curling strands between the trees. "You notice, Watson," Holmes said, "this corner of the yard is rarely visited. No marked headstones, no visible plots, too damp for traditional burials, and yet—" He knelt in the grass and ran his fingers through the earth. "The soil here is less compact. See this ridge, the slight depression beside it?" I crouched beside him, peering at the spot through the lantern's beam. "It could be erosion," I suggested. "It could be," Holmes agreed, "but erosion rarely forms in the shape of a coffin." He reached into his coat and produced a thin, collapsible steel probe. With careful precision, he inserted it into the ground. At roughly 2 feet deep, the rod struck resistance, not stone, not root, but the softened thud of old wood. He stood. "This is it," he said, "the second grave." We returned at first light with Constable Merrick and 2 labourers from the village, all of whom cast wary glances toward the clergy as Reverend Wickham opened the vestry. Holmes had secured permission under the pretence of examining historical inconsistencies in burial records, an explanation just vague enough to be permissible and just strange enough to discourage gossip. By mid-morning, the grave was open. What we found inside was not a skeleton, nor the shrouded corpse we half feared, but an old iron-bound chest. Roughly the size of a crate of firewood, it bore no name, no inscription. Just the interlocking ring emblem embossed faintly into the lid. The same as the wax seal from the warning letter. Holmes motioned for quiet. With a small iron key, retrieved earlier from a hidden recess in the vestry safe, he opened the chest. Inside lay a stack of documents, yellowed but legible, tied with red ribbon. On top rested a crucifix, carved from cherry wood, and beside it a velvet pouch. Holmes opened the pouch. From it fell 2 items, a bishop's signet ring and a fragment of blood-stained cloth. He held the ring up to the light. "Do you see?" I leaned in. "The initials A.D. Andrew of the Southern Diocese," Holmes confirmed. "The same bishop who sealed the vault below the organ, the one who chose silence." Merrick gave a low whistle. "You're saying this was his doing?" "I'm saying," Holmes replied, "that he hid the evidence here, away from diocesan scrutiny, and someone has been trying to recover it ever since." He motioned to the papers. "Watson, will you?" I untied the ribbon and opened the topmost document. It was written in Canon Morley's hand, sharp, slanted, and underlined in crimson ink. "Let it be known, the ledger has been altered. Bishop Andrew ordered me to falsify the entry for March 11th. I was promised elevation, but it came at a cost. The boy, Henry, discovered my correspondence with the solicitor. He had a copy. I demanded he return it. He refused. The next morning, he was gone. They said he drowned. I said nothing." I looked up. "So the bishop orchestrated this?" Holmes shook his head. "No, Morley did. The bishop abetted it, and then buried the truth." We turned to the next page. "Arthur Griggs was paid to misfile the bell toll. Aldous Finch saw too much. I fear the boy's diary still exists. If it is ever found, all is undone." The puzzle pieces were beginning to settle, grim and sharp-edged. "But why come back now?" I asked. "Why dig up a 20-year-old crime?" Holmes tapped the side of the chest. "Because someone knew the evidence had not been destroyed, because Henry's diary surfaced, and because, Watson, it was never about justice." He turned toward Merrick. "It was about leverage." We returned to the inn that afternoon to find Mrs. Daltrey pale and nervous. "Sir," she whispered to Holmes, "there's a gentleman waiting in your room. Says he knows you. Gave no name. He has a scar above his right brow and walks with a limp." Holmes stiffened. "Thank you." We climbed the stairs slowly. Outside the door to our room, Holmes paused and gestured for silence. He drew a thin-bladed knife from his inner coat, a curious thing he rarely used, but always carried, and turned the knob. Inside, seated calmly in the corner beside the window, was the man we had once called Allerton. His hair was now unkempt, and a bandage was wrapped around his left hand. His coat, once neatly buttoned, was torn at the sleeve. Yet his expression was oddly serene, as though he had been waiting for this moment all along. Holmes stepped forward. "Mr. Morley," he said quietly, "or whatever name you're using now, you have been very difficult to trace." The man smiled faintly. "You found the grave, then?" "We did." "And the diary?" Holmes nodded. "Then I suppose I'm finished hiding?" I stared. "You're Henry Morley?" The man gave a slow nod. "I survived. They tried to bury me, figuratively, not literally. I fled the village that night, bloodied, terrified, but alive. My father told the bishop I had drowned. They burned the evidence. Or so they thought." Holmes folded his arms. "You came back to reclaim it? To expose it? Finally, I've lived in shadows too long." "And Finch?" Holmes asked softly. Morley's face darkened. "I warned him to stay quiet, but he wanted it known. Said he would go to the papers. That wasn't the plan." Holmes's voice sharpened. "Did you harm him?" "No," Morley said quickly. "But someone else did, someone following me. I think the church knew I had returned. Someone higher, perhaps even one of Bishop Andrew's successors. They want the papers." Holmes glanced at me. "Watson, lock the door. No one else enters." As I turned the key, Holmes approached the man. "Mr. Morley, I must ask, who else knows you're here?" Morley hesitated. "I received a letter, no signature. It said, 'Deliver what remains or we bury you for real this time.'" He reached into his coat and handed Holmes a folded page. Holmes read it, then turned to me. "It's the same handwriting, the same seal." I felt a chill tighten across my shoulders. "So they're watching?" I said. Holmes nodded slowly. "And now they know. We've found everything." Holmes stood by the inn's window, half-drawn curtain in one hand, gaze fixed beyond the glass as twilight deepened over Harrow. Outside, the shadows of passing villagers drifted like murmurs along the cobbled street, innocent faces unaware of the centuries-old deceit that smouldered just beneath the soil of St. Dunstan's. Behind him, Henry Morley sat rigid in the armchair, his fingers clasped tightly over his knee, lips pressed to a thin white line. The truth had been pulled from the earth, but not yet into the light. And somewhere in that narrowing corridor between exposure and erasure, danger lingered, closer now than ever. "We can't wait for them to strike again," I said. "Whoever's behind the letters may already suspect we've pieced it together." Holmes nodded without turning. "Precisely why we must act before they do. The blood at the vicar's steps was not only a threat, it was a signature, a flourish by someone confident, someone inside the parish, perhaps even within the vicarage itself. And now that Mr. Morley has revealed himself, the game enters its final phase." Morley stirred. "You think they'll come for me?" Holmes turned. "I think they'll come for the diary. You're a complication. That book is a weapon." He strode to the desk and unfurled a rough map of the church grounds we had assembled days before, graves, pathways, outbuildings, and a hand-sketched cross-section of the crypt system beneath the nave. "They will attempt to retrieve it before it can be made public. Tonight." I frowned. "Tonight? Why so certain?" Holmes tapped the corner of the map. "Because tonight is Thursday, and on the last Thursday of every month, according to parish routine, the vestry remains unlocked until midnight. For candle inventory, choral planning, and steward inspections, the church will be unattended between evensong and compline." He looked to Morley. "You'll be seen at the inn, visibly, calmly. Let it be known, casually, that you've recovered your father's diary and intend to leave for London on the morning train." Morley hesitated. "That's dangerous." "It's bait," Holmes replied. "They won't allow you to leave, but they won't strike in the street. They'll go for the diary instead." "And where will the diary actually be?" I asked. "In the hollow of the old lectern in the sacristy," Holmes said. "Sealed for now, in a decoy cover, something unremarkable. And us? We'll be waiting." At 7:30, Holmes and I slipped into St. Dunstan's under cover of dusk. The nave was empty, save for the lingering scent of incense and the dim flicker of candlelight fading from the earlier service. A single sexton extinguished the last taper near the altar, bowed to the cross, and exited through the side door, unaware that his church was about to become a stage. Holmes moved quickly but silently. Behind the altar, we passed into the sacristy, a narrow, wood-panelled chamber lined with hooks for vestments, dusty hymnals, and a tall oak lectern at its centre. He opened the hinged top and placed a simple black notebook inside, bound with string. "Convincing enough from a distance," he said, shutting it. He turned to the far end of the chamber, where a false panel behind the reliquary concealed the narrow crawl space we had discovered 2 days prior, originally used by the verger in earlier centuries to access the crypt passages. We climbed in, lanterns extinguished, and crouched low among the stone ribs of the foundation, staring out through a narrow slit in the panel. The sacristy fell into darkness. Only the outline of the lectern was visible by the faint light of the moon through the stained glass above. We waited. And the first hour passed in silence, broken only by the distant tolling of the 9 o'clock bell and the ticking of Holmes's watch in the hush. My legs ached from the crouch, but I dared not shift. Holmes was a statue beside me, still focused, listening with a precision I could scarcely imagine. Then at precisely 24 minutes past 9 we heard it, a faint creak. The latch on the sacristy door moved slowly, carefully. Then the door opened, just enough for a shadow to pass through. A figure entered. I saw the outline of a man, tall, thin, wrapped in a dark coat. He moved directly to the lectern and paused, listening. Then he reached inside and removed the decoy notebook. Holmes touched my arm lightly, a signal. Wait. The figure turned toward the reliquary, then, unexpectedly, crossed to the chancel door and locked it from the inside. Insurance. He was taking his time. Holmes nodded. We burst from the crawl space as one, Holmes leaping forward with astonishing speed, I just behind. The man turned at the last second, startled but not panicked. He dropped the notebook and reached for his coat pocket. "Not tonight," Holmes said coldly, grabbing his wrist and twisting it behind his back. The man grunted in pain and fell to one knee. The object he had been reaching for clattered to the floor. A dagger. I swept it aside with my boot as Holmes pressed the intruder to the ground and pulled away his hood. I gasped. It was Reverend Wickham. Holmes did not release him immediately. His face betrayed no surprise, only the controlled calculation of a man whose theory had just settled into fact. "You knew all along," Holmes said. Wickham glared up at him. "I suspected, but I didn't think you'd find the vault." "You didn't think Henry would return," Holmes replied. "But he did." I stepped forward, heart pounding. "You were the one who followed Allerton. Morley, you wrote the warnings." Wickham didn't answer. Holmes continued. "You were the curate in 1879, Morley's student, his shadow. You helped suppress the scandal, and when the bishop died, you inherited his secrets." Wickham's voice was bitter. "I inherited rot, a legacy of deceit. I kept the parish running while the diocese turned its back. Do you know what it means to protect the church from within?" Holmes stood slowly, his expression unreadable. "You protected power, not faith." Wickham looked at the broken dagger on the floor. "You don't understand. If the diary goes public, it will destroy everything. Dozens of names. Dead men cannot defend themselves." "Nor can a 17-year-old boy," Holmes said coldly. Outside, footsteps approached. The signal from Merrick. Holmes nodded toward the door. "Watson, if you'd be so kind." I stepped into the nave and waved. A moment later, Constable Merrick entered, and Holmes turned over the Reverend with a brief account. As Wickham was led away, Holmes picked up the discarded decoy book and placed it back in the lectern. "The real diary," he said, "remains with Miss Morley, as it should." Later that night, as we stepped into the cold air beneath the stars, Holmes exhaled slowly and turned toward the lich gate. "The sins of the father," he murmured, "were never meant to bury the living. And yet—" He fell silent. "What troubles you?" I asked. He glanced back at the church. "There's still the matter of Finch." I froze. "You think he's alive?" "I think," Holmes said, "Wickham wasn't working alone." It was well past midnight when we returned to Baker Street, not to our lodgings in London, but rather to the borrowed guest rooms in the rear of the Harrow Green Inn, which Mrs. Daltrey had insisted we take free of charge for the trouble you've done the lot of us. Holmes, of course, had already refused 3 times, then accepted with a faint smile and a vague nod. But he didn't sleep. Instead, he paced. From the hearth to the window and back again, coat still on, hands clasped behind his back, his expression clouded with something between unease and inevitability. I watched him from my chair near the fire, drowsiness tugging at my limbs, but too much unsettled in my mind to rest. "You're not satisfied," I said at last. Holmes stopped. "No." Wickham confessed. To the theft, to the letters, to his part in the long burial of Canon Morley's sins, but not to everything. Holmes turned to the mantelpiece and leaned forward, staring into the fire as though it held answers inked in flame. "Finch is still missing," he said, "and Wickham has no motive to keep him alive. His interests were the suppression of legacy, the preservation of reputation. If Finch knew too much, Wickham would have killed him the moment he opened the shed door." "Unless he already had," I offered grimly. Holmes shook his head. "No body, no sign, not Wickham's style either. He was precise. When he wished to frighten, he wrote. When he wished to destroy, he made it look like bureaucracy. No, someone else is involved, someone Wickham protected." He turned to face me fully. "And we've seen him?" I sat up straighter. "We have?" Holmes nodded. "Someone who walked freely between the sacred and the secret. Someone with access to the vestry, the crypts, and the old bell tower. Someone overlooked because they never truly spoke." A cold realization began to dawn. "The bell ringer," I whispered. Holmes's eyes lit faintly. "Not Griggs, of course. He died in 1881, but someone who took up his post. Quietly, unofficially, a figure the town forgot, and yet—" He moved to the desk and pulled from his coat a folded page, one I recognized as a fragment from Henry Morley's diary. He laid it flat. He follows me again. I see him from the crypt steps just beyond the rope. He never speaks, but always watches. I asked Father once who he was. Father said only, 'He tolls for the dead.'" A moment passed in heavy silence. "He's still here," Holmes said. By the grey hour before dawn, we stood at the base of the belfry steps. The tower of St. Dunstan's rose like a blind monolith against the paling sky, the bells above still, but the silence below unnaturally loud. Holmes ascended first, lantern held low, footsteps barely audible on the worn spiral of stone. I followed, heart beating loud enough to echo. The stairwell narrowed the higher we climbed, the air colder, older. At the top was a wooden hatch, ajar. Holmes stopped, listened, then pushed it open. The bell chamber was dim. Shafts of weak morning light filtered through slits in the walls. Pigeons stirred in the rafters. And near the largest bell, its tarnished brass, hulking like a hanging titan, sat a figure in a dark cassock, hunched and motionless. He was trimming something with a small knife, an old bootlace, frayed and grey. Holmes stepped forward. "You've been watching us," he said calmly. The figure paused, then looked up. He was older than I expected. Balding, with watery eyes and deep creases around his mouth. His hands were stained with oil and candle soot. Around his neck hung a small wooden crucifix. His boots were tied with mismatched laces. "I keep the bells," he said simply. Holmes nodded. "And you kept the secret?" The man shrugged. "The church never asked questions, nor did I. I rang when told, I swept when told, but I saw more than they knew." "Finch," Holmes said. The bell ringer flinched only slightly. "He's alive," Holmes continued. "Somewhere close. You took him." The man said nothing. Holmes stepped closer. "Wickham protected you, paid you perhaps, promised the role of caretaker in exchange for silence. But when Morley returned and the diary resurfaced, he needed your help again. You followed orders once more." Still no reply. Holmes looked at the tool belt on the floor, rusted keys, nails, a flask of oil. Among them, a folded piece of paper. He picked it up. It was a crude map of the church's north foundation. "Watson," Holmes said, "he didn't take Finch far. He hid him beneath the bell platform near the old rope pit." The bell ringer stood suddenly, hand twitching toward his belt, but Holmes raised a hand. "Enough! No one will harm you unless you make it so." The man hesitated. then slowly lowered himself back onto the stool, the knife clattering to the floor. "He wouldn't stop asking," he murmured. "Finch. Questions. About the ledger, about the boy, about the vault. Said he was going to the newspapers." "You tried to scare him," Holmes said, but he wouldn't be scared." "No." "So you locked him away." A long silence. Then, "He's fed. Safe. But the others, they wanted him gone." An hour later, Constable Merrick and a team of labourers uncovered a bricked passage behind the north transept, concealed beneath a stack of broken hymn benches and rotting altar cloths. The bricks gave way to a narrow cell no larger than a cupboard, candlelit and musty. Inside, on a wool blanket, and with a cracked teacup beside him, sat Aldous Finch, alive, tired, and smiling faintly as Holmes offered a hand. "I told him," Finch said hoarsely, "you'd find me." Holmes's voice was soft. It was never in question. Later that morning, as the church bells tolled for the morning prayers, this time rung by Merrick himself, Holmes and I stood once more beside the unmarked grave beneath the yew. "The truth is now exhumed," I said. "The boy, the diary, the cover-up. Wickham will stand trial." Holmes remained silent. "What troubles you now?" I asked. He turned toward the village square where Cora Morley could be seen speaking with Finch. "Justice may come," he said, "but slowly. The church will deny. The records may vanish again. Names will be scrubbed, and Wickham, he may not face the punishment he deserves. But Henry's story will be told." Holmes nodded. "That at least we've preserved." A pause, then he looked at me. "There's one final gathering to be made, Watson." I frowned. "Who?" Holmes's expression darkened. "The last man to sign Henry Morley's death into the vestry book." The clock above the parish hall struck 10:30 as a pale sun fought to pierce the clouds above Harrow. The village green, still wet from the early morning mist, seemed unusually quiet for a Saturday. Inside the old rectory meeting room, a modest space used for choir rehearsals and church teas, Holmes had summoned them all. Every figure remaining in this mystery had been drawn, one by one, into the room under polite but firm invitations penned in Holmes's own hand. Now they sat in a circle of wooden chairs, their expressions varying between confusion, irritation, and, in one case, outright fear. Reverend Wickham, under police guard, was granted presence under Merrick's close supervision. Cora Morley sat to one side, composed but wary. Aldous Finch, freshly cleaned, and still pale from his confinement, sat across from her, flanked by the ever-watchful Holmes and myself. And beside the hearth, silent as a penitent ghost, sat the bell-ringer, the mute caretaker Holmes had identified only hours earlier as a central player in the quiet conspiracy that had gripped Harrow for more than 2 decades. Holmes rose slowly. "You may wonder why I've gathered you all," he began, his voice even. "Some of you believe this matter to be finished, that justice is already underway, and the ghost of Henry Morley can finally be laid to rest. I regret to inform you that this is not yet true." A murmur rippled through the room. Wickham's eyes narrowed. Holmes walked to the window and turned. The tragedy of St. Dunstan's is not just that a boy was silenced, nor that his father's corruption reached into the sanctum of the church. It is that even now those tasked with cleansing the rot were themselves complicit, willing to sacrifice truth to preserve reputation. He let that hang. "Mr. Finch," Holmes continued, "you saw what you should not have seen. A second, hidden grave, the bishop's ring, the falsified ledger. But you also saw who carried the original vestry book into the vault that night. Yes?" Finch, startled, nodded slowly. "I did?" Holmes turned. "And was it Canon Morley?" "No," Finch said. "I thought it was, but he was shorter. limped, and he wore the ring on the wrong hand. Holmes nodded, because it was not the canon, nor Wickham. He turned toward the group. It was the Archdeacon of Marlbrook. A sharp intake of breath came from Cora Morley. "That's impossible," she whispered. "He was my godfather." Holmes turned toward me. "Watson, the name signed beneath the burial entry for H.M. What was it?" I thought back. "Merely initials. A.P. Holmes looked at the group. "Archibald Prynne, then the assistant to Bishop Andrew, now the Archdeacon." Wickham stirred, his voice hoarse. "You can't prove that." "On the contrary," Holmes replied. "You led me to it." He opened his coat and drew forth a slim envelope, sealed with a red wax emblem. "This letter," he said, "was discovered among the diocesan archive documents Wickham attempted to destroy. It contains a list of disbursements and travel arrangements, money paid to a curate for an unofficial burial, and the temporary housing of a boy pending return to ecclesiastical custody. Signed by A.P. He turned toward Merrick, who took the envelope silently. "More to the point," Holmes continued, "I made inquiries of the archivist. In March of 1879, the only active church official with those initials and with authority over burial registers was Archibald Prynne." A stunned silence fell. Holmes walked slowly around the group. "Prynne signed the ledger. He misfiled the bell ringer's log, and when Canon Morley died, he elevated Wickham to ensure continued silence. But it didn't end there." He faced Cora Morley. "Miss Morley, you said your godfather visited often in your youth." "Yes," she said, frowning. "He was always kind." "And you kept a letter from him?" She blinked. "Yes, among my mother's things." Holmes extended a hand. "Might I see it?" A moment later, she retrieved a folded sheet from her handbag. Holmes opened it and held it to the light. "Same hand as the warning note sent to Mr. Morley," he said softly. Cora's hand flew to her mouth. "Are you saying he sent the threats?" "I believe so," Holmes replied. Prynne feared that Henry or someone else might recover the diary and expose him, and when Henry returned to Harrow under the name Allerton, Prynne used Wickham and the bell ringer to suppress the information once more. Holmes turned to the silent caretaker. "You took orders from two men, one you feared, the other you revered. But it was the latter who sent you to kidnap Finch, wasn't it?" The caretaker stared at the floor, but his nod was almost imperceptible. "Why not kill him?" Holmes asked gently. The caretaker's lips parted. "I couldn't. He was kind." Holmes turned toward Merrick. "I suggest you send word to Marlbrook at once. Archdeacon Prynne must be arrested. The vestry logs, the sealed correspondence, and Henry Morley's diary provide sufficient cause." Merrick nodded grimly and exited. As the door closed behind him, Cora sat back, stunned. "All these years," she whispered. "The man who baptized me, who held my hand at Mother's funeral, was the one who buried my cousin alive in shame." Holmes sat beside her. "Truth is often strangled with the softest hands, Miss Morley." He paused, then added, "But it tends to rise all the same." Wickham was led out without further word. The bell ringer followed, murmuring a prayer in Latin as he passed beneath the archway. Holmes remained behind. I joined him in the quiet. "You've done it," I said. "Unravelled every thread." Holmes stared at the empty chairs. "Justice is a frayed thing, Watson. It comes unravelled even in the hands of good men. But yes, the knot is tied now." He stood. "One chapter ends," I met his gaze, "and another begins." Holmes's eyes glinted. Indeed, for this story's epilogue must belong to Henry Morley. It was a week to the day since the final gathering in the parish hall, when the bells of St. Dunstan's rang again, twice in measured succession, with a silence between, as was custom when one of the village's oldest families passed into history. But this toll was not for death, it was for remembrance. The sun was low over Harrow, casting long shadows across the sloped cemetery, where moss had begun to claim the letters on half-forgotten tombs. Yet today, one marker stood new among the old, a polished slate headstone, its inscription carved with simplicity and care. Henry Morley, beloved son, silenced by shame, remembered by truth. A cluster of villagers had gathered nearby, not many, for scandal still clung faintly to the name. But Cora Morley stood at the head, her veil lifted, her voice steady, as she read aloud a passage from Henry's recovered diary. Aldous Finch stood beside her, hands clasped behind his back, clean-shaven now, his coat neatly mended. And farther back, by the lich gate, Holmes and I watched in silence. "He once told me," Cora said softly, "that truth is a burden, but silence is a curse. For 20 years he bore that burden alone. I hope today he feels it has finally been shared." She stepped away, and the vicar, an interim, cleric sent from the bishopric pending Wickham's replacement, offered a short blessing. Then the group dispersed, quietly, respectfully, like shadows melting into the village fog. Only Henry remained, and those who had once turned away now gave him their eyes. Later that day, in the vicarage study, now hollowed of its former tenant and stripped of the claustrophobic air that had clung to it since our arrival, Holmes and I sat over a pot of weak tea, the diary lying closed between us. Cora entered with a letter in her hand. "It's from the diocese," she said, a touch of disbelief in her voice. "They've acknowledged Henry's wrongful burial. The archdeacon has resigned." "And the bishop?" I asked. "Too ill to stand trial, but his successor has promised transparency. A committee has been formed to review other sealed records from the 1870s. Holmes arched an eyebrow. "Institutional penance. Always slow, often cosmetic." Cora nodded. "But it's a start." She placed the letter beside the diary. "I'll be taking Henry's story to print. I've already contacted a journal interested in historical injustices. They want to publish his words exactly as he wrote them." Holmes gave a slight smile. "That would please him, I think." She looked at him. "And you? What will you do next?" Holmes sipped his tea. "Return to Baker Street. Reorganize my files. Instruct Mrs. Hudson not to rearrange the tobacco jar. Life, Miss Morley, is composed of small orderings, especially after disorder." Her eyes softened. "Thank you, Mr. Holmes." He inclined his head. "I merely cleared the fog. You gave the truth its voice." Outside, the village seemed brighter. Not changed, perhaps, but shifted. The gossips on the green now spoke in softer tones. Children no longer hesitated near the church gates. The caretaker's quarters had been cleaned, his tools returned, but the bells would no longer be rung by the man who had once stood silent at every burial, complicit through obedience. Finch had been offered the post. He declined. Instead, he'd taken a position cataloguing the church archives, an effort Holmes had quietly suggested to the bishop's secretary. Finch would now spend his days sifting through the past, but no longer burying it. That evening, as Holmes and I prepared to depart Harrow by train, we stood once more by Henry's grave. Holmes removed his hat. "No case ever truly ends," he said. "Only the telling does." I looked toward the church spire, rising against the pale evening sky. "You believe others still guard secrets?" "I know they do, but truth, once unearthed, is a stubborn thing. Like a seed, it grows." He turned to me. "Watson, remind me, what did you note about the second toll of the bell?" I frowned. It marked the second loss in a family. or the lifting of a silence? Holmes nodded. Then let this be its echo. We stood for another moment, and then Holmes tapped his cane gently on the gravel path. Come, Watson, we've miles to go and a fireless hearth waiting. As we walked toward the station, the village of Harrow behind us, the bells of St. Dunstan's rang out once more, 2 soft, clear tolls across the fading light. Not for death, but for Henry Morley, whose silence had ended at last. And for the truth which had been given its voice,